This video is for Chapter 14 of the Criminological Theory, Context, and Consequences book. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the biological and biosocial theories that have started to become more prevalent in the field of criminology. If you remember some of our early discussions about the classical school and then the transition to the positive school of criminology with Lombroso, most notably. Lombroso did a lot of research of a biological nature. And if you remember, he looked at things like the bumps on people's heads, their arm lengths, and their body compositions of different kinds. So there were some early biological theories, but early research efforts in that area didn't prove fruitful, and so it was mostly abandoned. And by the 1960s, there really was almost no biological influence at all in criminological theory. The theories we've been looking at up to now have been primarily what we call sociological theories, theories that deal with people's personal characteristics, the environments they grew up in, the kind of people they associate with. So really no biological influence in any of those theories at all. By the mid-1970s, there was kind of some interest starting to re-emerge, though, in a biological approach to criminology. And some of this had to do with the fact that technology just had advanced so much. And this is when we started to be able to look at things like DNA and mapping people's genes and things like that. So there started to become an interest in whether or not our genetics played a role in our likelihood of becoming involved in crime or not. Here you see a couple of researchers that were kind of instrumental in some of this. There's a guy named Ellis who really kind of promoted the idea that a scientific approach looking at some of these technological advances, he believed they held greater promise than just purely sociological approaches. There was this idea that with DNA and looking at the genetics of a person, that we could just get to a more detailed level and be able to explain more than our sociological theories were doing. And some people started to call for what was referred to as a general systems theory. And this was a movement that wanted to use biological ideas to build upon the sociological theories that we had. And that is some of what you see today, actually. When biology started becoming more prevalent again, there was a lot of resistance to that among most mainstream criminologists. And honestly, that's probably what fueled the fire a little bit to keep that research going, because whenever there's a large group of people resisting something, there always seems to be some other group of people that wants to push back. And so so it hasn't gone away, and it's been growing, and probably will continue to grow. Just in the time that since I left policing and have gone to graduate school and started teaching, just in the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen a lot of growth in that area, and you start seeing more and more research. And it's an interesting area. It does take a little bit of learning to catch up with some of the technical jargon and things they use, but it's very interesting. And one of the most important things that's come out of what we call biosocial research, it's the combination of biology and sociology. One of the most important things that has come out of that is not just that biology determines crime, but biological traits can interact with your social environment, and that is very important in the shaping of human behavior. So it's not just that someone has some particular trait, it's that they may have a trait that interacts with a negative social environment that then creates the problems. And that's been an interesting outgrowth of biological research, because actually what a lot of biological research tells us is that the sociological aspects are still very important because they interact with these biological traits in certain ways. But looking at those biological traits is also informative as well. Biosocial criminology is really a more broad and powerful way to look at things than using just sociological theories on their own. Like I said earlier, it's become a larger part of criminology as time has gone on, and it will probably become even larger than it is now. So if you're looking for an interesting area to get into that's relatively new, and you plan on pursuing your criminology education further than the undergraduate program, that might be an area that would be interesting to get into. And at the beginning and end of the 1990s, it was noted in some research and studies that were done that about 85% of criminologists in America were pretty much strict environmental criminologists, meaning they looked more at the influences of the environment rather than biology. So all through the 1990s that was pretty stagnant, but I'm sure it's more than that now. One of the risks you run in being a biosocial criminologist is people get very fearful about types of research that you do because they don't understand it. And you can be charged with being a racist or a sexist, but biological criminology is not really about race or sex, in the way that people traditionally think about it. And we'll get more into what some of the theories are about as we move along here. But most biosocial criminologists will reject the idea that biology predetermines someone's fate. And that's what a lot of people are afraid of, that we're going to have these biological ideas where we kind of pigeonhole people into some role before they even have a chance to grow up and demonstrate what they're going to do. But that's not what biosocial criminology is about. It really just suggests, as I said before, that genetic traits interact with our environment and that shapes human behavior. So really what a biosocial criminologist would say is that certainly only studying the environment is not enough, but only studying biology is not enough either. What we really need to do is study both and see how they interact, and that's what biosocial criminology is really aiming more at. There are a few different categories that biosocial approaches have been divided into. There's evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, and genetics. Evolutionary psychology kind of looks at thinking processes, that sort of thing. Neuroscience deals more with brain function, and then genetics, of course, is dealing with people's DNA and their genes and how those traits manifest themselves. One of the things you see discussed in biological research is what we call protective factors and risk factors, and because again, no biological trait guarantees that you're going to be a criminal or guarantees you won't be a criminal. All we can do really is talk about, some trait might be a risk factor for criminal activity, which just means it might make you more likely. It's not a guarantee, but it makes you more likely. There are other traits that can be protective factors, meaning that they may keep you from getting involved in criminal behavior. Again, not a guarantee, but it kind of makes you lean that way. So looking at these categories of biosocial theory, and I'm not going to go through every single theory in the book, make sure you do the reading so that you're familiar with everything they talk about there, but I'm going to go over some of the key concepts and how they relate to what we've talked about so far. One evolutionary theory is kind of revisiting the ideas that Darwin had about the evolution of species. And when you look at evolution, really what it comes down to is that there's this urge that people or animals have to mate with someone of the opposite sex so that they can pass on their genes and have offspring that will carry their genes forward in the gene pool. There is what some have called a cheater theory, which really is intended to explain why so many men will cheat on their girlfriends or spouses as compared to females, where that's much less frequent of an occurrence by most accounts. So it's really kind of explained as this alternative reproductive strategy to ensure that genes are passed on to succeeding generations, and that's why men have these biological urges to procreate with as many women as possible to ensure that their genes are passed on. And so that's one kind of theory to explain some of the behavior of males. There's also what we call alternative adaptation theory, which really just says that some people inherit a greater tendency to engage in antisocial behavior than others, and are driven more by kind of their primal urges more so than by their parenting urges. So that's another theory. Then there's also what we call evolutionary expropriative theory, which basically says all humans have an equal genetic potential for antisocial behavior, and they are genetically driven to acquire resources to ensure reproduction. So again, it's just arguing that this need to reproduce is genetically based, but that all people really have equal potential for this antisocial behavior, and it's probably other influences that determine whether or not they actually engage in antisocial behavior. Evolutionary theories are really, they're very rarely purely biological theories. They really are biosocial theories, because there's the genetic component, the biological component, but then there's also this environment component as well that interplays with all of that. One of the things we have to remember about Darwin's theories is that the unit of analysis that he used was the species. He was not ever trying to say anything about why one particular person or one particular animal did something. He was looking at the process of natural selection across species. So if we're going to talk about those kinds of concepts in crime-related topics, we need to be very careful about what unit of analysis we apply those ideas to. Another thing that crops up in this is that one of the things that's key in these evolutionary theories is this idea that there are certain traits that pass on and survive from one generation to the next. And sometimes there's this assumption that just because a trait survives from one generation to the next, it's kind of assumed that it's a good one, because we kind of assume, oh well, if it was a bad trait, then it wouldn't survive and it would be phased out. But that's not always the case. So not all traits that survive are positive. There may be some that are detrimental. You probably remember Agnew from general strain theory. One of Agnew's newer ideas is what he called social concern theory. And it's really kind of an evolutionary psychology type of a theory, because essentially what this theory says is that people will not be involved in crime if they care about the welfare of others, if they desire to have close ties to other people, if they follow their moral intuitions and conform to the behavior and views of others and the social norms, and if we sanction those who violate the norms. So this is looking at the trait of compassion or empathy, those kinds of things. Because evolutionary psychology would say that this persistence of these traits of caring and compassion and that sort of thing is a positive thing, and the more we can get people to act that way, the less they should be involved in antisocial behavior. So this is just a very brief overview. Agnew, I think, wrote a whole book on this theory, or at least a chapter of a book. But this construct of social concern is hypothesized to have a direct negative effect on crime. meaning the higher your social concern is, the lower your likelihood of participating in crime, and vice versa. So moving on a little bit to just an overview of some of the ideas in neuroscience. A lot of the new biosocial approaches, acknowledge the importance of the learning process. But what biosocial criminology has done is emphasize the extent to which the learning and conditioning of behavior happen differently for different people because of the way everybody's different neurological chemicals and everything interact with their particular environment. And this includes prior to being born. If you have a baby who's in the womb and the mother is doing drugs and smoking and drinking and doing lots of things like that, that's been shown to affect the brain development of babies. Whereas a mother who is not engaging in those kind of things might produce a child with very different outcomes. So this can happen in the womb and after the womb, obviously. But that's what some of these neuroscience theories are starting to look at. It's just different ways the brain develops and how your environment influences the way your brain develops. So here are some theories that your book discusses. I'm not going to go through them here in detail. You can read about them. But there's brain hemispheric theory, talking about which hemisphere of the brain criminals tend to use more versus non-criminals. There's reward dominance theory, which examines the how rewards influence people's behaviors differently in some people than it does in others. There's the prefrontal lobe theory, suboptimal arousal theory, and seizuring theory, which is kind of controversial, which basically just says offenders have more seizures than non-offenders, but classifying people that way is probably somewhat problematic. But we'll go through a couple of little details on these theories, but we're not going to go too deeply into them. One of the things that some of the newer biosocial theories have looked at is family studies. And there have been quite a few studies done that examine twins, both identical twins and fraternal twins, because with those kinds of people, you can identify how much of their genetic components they share. And so you can look at the differences between those groups to determine how much of an influence the environment had on their development and their behavior. So some other biosocial theories that are out there. There are theories that look at disorders of the central nervous system. And one of the things you see is they talk about suboptimal arousal. And what this really means is, there's a theory out there that some people just aren't stimulated as easily as other people. And by stimulated, I mean their sense of excitement, their sense of fear, those kinds of things. And so people that have a hard time being stimulated in that way, it's argued, will participate in riskier activities than other people because they don't want to get bored and they want to feel that sense of fear or the rush of adrenaline or whatever. And so crime, it's argued, is one of those risky activities that these people might engage in. And so there's this idea that people who are not easily aroused may participate in crime more so than those who are. Related to this idea of hypoarousal is what we call fearlessness theory, which just argues that low levels of arousal mean that these people just don't experience fear that as easily as other people do. So they're kind of fearless, and so they are less likely to avoid situations that will get them involved with the police. Stimulation theory is very similar. Again, seeking out sensory stimulation to avoid boredom, and criminal behavior might be one way that some people would do that. Looking also at brain development, there is actually quite a bit of research that's been done that looks at the association between frontal lobe dysfunction and crime. And violence is what has been most associated with frontal lobe dysfunction, whereas sex offenses have been associated with other parts of the brain. And that's because the frontal lobe of your brain is where all of your executive cognitive functions are. This is the part of the brain that says, hey, it's probably not a good idea to fight with the police. Even though I'm right, I'll probably lose. It's that part of your brain. So people that have, maybe a developmental delay or dysfunction in that part of the brain, they just don't process those kinds of decisions the same. And so they may be more likely to be drawn into criminal behavior because they just don't have the ability to make those decisions. And in fact, it's been shown also that the frontal lobe doesn't really fully develop in males until about the age of 24, 25, somewhere in there. And so that kind of explains why you see males younger than that who frequently do things that you look at and go, what in the world was that guy thinking? And the answer is he probably wasn't, because his brain isn't fully developed. Another thing that's in this part of the brain is the risk assessment capability that people have. And they just inaccurately assess the risks of engaging in a particular behavior just because their brain isn't developed enough to do so. And that kind of explains why people, maybe get a little more cautious as they get older because their brain actually fully develops and they start thinking about those kinds of things differently. One of the challenges with these biochemical theories and neuroscience theories is really a time ordering issue. Which came first? Because participating in certain behaviors and growing up in a certain environment can cause neurological problems. But neurological problems can also cause antisocial behaviors. So it's when you do this kind of research, that's one of the things you have to try and tease out is the time ordering of these issues. And it's difficult. And so you have to be very careful about saying that one thing causes another. If you take statistics, you'll learn that being able to really say that one thing causes another is more difficult than it actually sounds. One of the problems that has plagued criminology for as long as criminology has been around is what we call the age crime curve. And you've no doubt seen a graph of this drawn somewhere, but this is the graph that shows the relationship between age and criminal behavior. And when you're born, of course, you're not engaging in any crime at that age. But then as you get older, you have a tendency to participate in more and more delinquency. It peaks around age 16, 17, 18 years old, and then there's a pretty good drop-off. And then by the time people get to be, 25, 30, 40 years old, their level of antisocial behavior usually decreases quite a bit. And so that's one of the things criminology really hasn't ever been able to explain satisfactorily. We know the relationship exists, that there's this point at which people peak in their criminal behavior, and then there's a big drop-off that coincides with age. But why that happens has not really been satisfactorily explained. You can say, well, it's because they got older. Well, that's not really an explanation. The question is, well, why does getting older cause you to reduce your criminal behavior in such a dramatic fashion? And there are a lot of sociological explanations that have been offered for that, but biosocial criminology is exploring biological explanations for that. And one of the things that they have looked at is increases in testosterone during male adolescence, which is associated with aggressiveness, and then testosterone in males usually starts to taper off as they get older. And there are some other ideas out there. That's just one of them. but trying to look at what biological factors might influence this relationship between age and crime is an interesting area of study. Most of you should have at least heard of Moffat's life course theory, and this really, even though it wasn't a biosocial theory when it was written, it really is kind of the first biosocial theory of modern criminology. And Moffat argued that there were two groups of offenders, and this was a juvenile delinquency theory, so she's really looking at adolescence. One is what she called life course persistent offenders, and these were kids that would just commit lots of crime all through their life. Didn't really matter what you did. Their level of offending stayed high all through their life. And then there was what she called adolescence limited offenders, which were the people that fit more the typical age crime curve that I described earlier. They would peak during adolescence, then they would taper off. And what she argued is that really we don't need to pay attention to these adolescence limited offenders because they're going to age out of crime no matter what we do. So there's no reason to spend a lot of resources on them. The people we need to identify and work with are the life course persistent offenders. And what she argued is that the reason kids became life course persistent offenders was because they had some neurological deficit that interacted with a negative environment and caused them to be antisocial throughout their life. That's her theory in kind of a nutshell. So, really, this was kind of the first theory that tried to draw in kind of a biological component. And like I said earlier, there is actually a lot of research to support this idea. That a lot of research on Moffat's theory showed that you can take a kid with some kind of neurological deficit, and there are a lot of different ones you can talk about. ADD or ADHD is just an example. But you can take a kid with one of these neurological problems, and if they have a positive social environment, they can do just as well as any other kid. When you get into problems is when you have a kid with a neurological deficit of that kind, but then living in a negative social environment. That's when you get problems, and they're more likely to become these life course persistent offenders. So again, it's that interaction of the biological with the sociological that produces the most problems. And so that's been one of the things that characterized this theory of Terry Moffat. So just looking at this neuroscience idea, in the last 2 decades, of course, this has advanced very rapidly because technology has been, progressing at such a rapid rate. And it also starts to give us an understanding of why cognitive types of therapies succeed with offenders. When you look at rehabilitation programs, some of the programs that have been documented to be the most successful are those that we call cognitive behavioral therapies. And these are therapies that basically try to change the way people think about their situation, getting them to be aware of their environment, the people around them, and change the way they assess the decisions they make. And those kinds of therapies have been successful. But there's still, of course, a lot of research and work to be done in this area. Looking briefly at behavioral genetics, this is an area that tries to determine how much of our behavior is inherited based on the genetic traits that we acquire versus what we get from our environment. I mean, certainly genetics and environment probably both play a significant role, but behavioral genetics is trying to look at what is it about our genetics that makes us do certain things versus how much is attributed to the environment. In some of the research that's been done, what they've found is that genetics actually does play a pretty big role in the level of fearlessness someone has, their aggressiveness, sensation seeking, impulsivity, and low IQ. Those are all traits that are very strongly tied to genetics and not so much to the environment, although again both always play a role, but those are primarily genetic traits. And behavioral genetics really started with the observation that women participate in antisocial behavior far less than males do. And this is another one of the relationships in criminology that is known, but it's not known exactly why it's the case. Look at our prison populations. It's always about 85% male and 15% female. And women just don't participate in as much crime as men do. And so one of the things that this research tries to explain is why. Why do males participate in so much more crime? And one of the arguments is that, well, males are just socialized to be more aggressive. Behavioral genetics would say, well, yes, but there are also very real biological differences between males and females that probably create differences in their behaviors. And so trying to figure out what component of that is attributed to genetics and what component is attributed to just how we socialize boys versus girls is actually harder than it sounds. But that's one of the things this area of research is trying to do. So continuing on with that idea, the gender differences that have been observed pretty much suggest that these genetic differences between males and females might be associated with the crime, that it's not just all environment or socialization. But you have to remember that when we talk about genetic traits, again, we're not saying that any genetic trait makes a guarantee that someone is going to turn out a certain way. We talk about general predispositions, that some people just have the personality or the traits that just make them more likely to participate in crime than others. And so we usually talk about likelihoods, not guarantees that anyone will turn out some certain way. So the last thing we'll talk about is what they call molecular genetics, and this is the science that focuses on the detailed processes by which our genes create our traits and behaviors, and look specifically at DNA and kind of mapping the genes that are on the DNA and how that creates our our different traits. The only thing I'll really say about this at this point is that there's a pretty unanimous agreement that there is no crime gene. There is no gene on your DNA that says this person will be a criminal or this person will be antisocial. It's really a combination of other types of traits that create a predisposition towards criminal activity. And again, like I said earlier, even if you have a genetic predisposition towards criminal behavior, the environment that trait interacts with is going to be very important in determining whether or not you actually go down that road or not. So just to wrap this up, these three categories, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, and genetics, have made significant contributions to the field of criminology. There's still a lot of resistance to this research because some people are afraid it might lead to kind of a genetic cleansing, so to speak, of our population. Say, oh, well, if we can just identify this one gene, then these are the people we know we should get rid of. That's not really where this work is going, but some people are afraid of that sort of thing. But what I've gathered over the period of time that I've spent studying this is that it's really important to look at contributions from both sides of the fence, the biological side and the sociological side, because like I said, it's really kind of ironic that one of the most important findings that's come out of biological criminology is to reinforce how important the environment really is. Because even people that have these genetic predispositions, a positive environment can actually create a totally different outcome than if that person interacts with a negative environment. So it's kind of ironic that that's one of the important findings that's come out of biosocial criminology. But make sure you take a look at the book, read up on these theories. If you have any questions, get in touch with me, and I'll be talking to you soon.